What would it truly feel like to wake up with nothing but the clothes on your back in medieval Europe? How would you survive when society has cast you to its very margins? What desperate strategies would you employ just to see another sunrise? And how did thousands of people navigate this harsh reality every single day for centuries? Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the forgotten corners of the past in soothing detail. I'm your host, and I'm genuinely curious. Where are you checking in from tonight? What time is it where you are? Whether you're winding down after a long day or settling in for the night, you've found the perfect place to let history carry you into peaceful rest. If you truly enjoy these boring history stories that help you drift off to sleep, I'd appreciate a gentle like on this video. And if you find yourself returning to explore more forgotten corners of the past with us, consider subscribing to become part of our growing community. Your presence here, listening to these quiet tales from history, makes you an important part of what we're building together. Thank you for your continued support. It means more than you know. Before we begin our journey into medieval streets, why not make yourself completely comfortable? Perhaps dim the lights around you. Maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background noise. Whatever helps you settle in. And please, let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or simply check in and say hello. Your suggestions help shape these journeys we take together. Tonight, we're stepping into the worn, tattered shoes of medieval Europe's most vulnerable population, the beggars who lined the streets of every town and city. We'll explore not just their daily struggles, but the complex social world they inhabited, the ingenious survival strategies they developed, and the surprising ways they fit into medieval society. So close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to be transported to a world where survival required creativity, resilience, and an intimate knowledge of human nature, the daily reality of medieval begging. Picture yourself awakening not in a warm bed, but on cold stone steps outside a church, your body aching from another night spent on unforgiving surfaces. The first pale light of dawn creeps across the medieval town, and already you can hear the sounds of a world coming to life around you, a world that will largely pretend you don't exist. This is your reality as a medieval beggar, and every single day begins with the same fundamental question: how will you survive the next 24 hours? Your clothes, the same ones you've worn for weeks, are damp with morning dew and smell of unwashed wool, sweat, and the accumulated grime of street life. The fabric is rough against your skin, patched and repatched until the original garment is barely recognizable. Your shoes, if you're fortunate enough to have them, are more holes than leather, offering little protection against the cold stones beneath your feet. Most likely, you've wrapped your feet in strips of cloth, or simply learned to ignore the constant ache of walking barefoot on medieval streets filled with refuse, animal waste, and sharp stones. The gnawing sensation in your stomach is your constant companion. You haven't eaten a proper meal in days, perhaps weeks. Yesterday's meager findings, maybe a crust of bread tossed from a window or the remnants of food left by others, did little to satisfy your body's desperate needs. Your mouth feels dry and sticky, and you know that finding clean water will be another challenge in the day ahead. The public wells are controlled by townspeople who view you with suspicion and disgust, and you've learned to time your approaches carefully, waiting for moments when fewer people are around to witness your presence. As you struggle to your feet, every joint protests. Sleeping on stone and earth has taken its toll on your body. Your back aches constantly, your knees crack with each movement, and your hands are permanently stiff from exposure to cold and damp. The medieval world offers no comfort for those without homes. no understanding of the physical toll that constant exposure takes on the human body. You've aged years in months, your face weathered beyond your actual years, your hair matted and unwashed. But survival begins with movement. And so you start your daily journey through the town's streets, following routes you've memorized over months or years of practice. You know which areas offer the best opportunities and which ones harbor the greatest dangers. The merchant quarter awakens early, with shopkeepers preparing for the day's trade. But they're also quick to chase away anyone they perceive as bad for business. The residential areas of the wealthy offer potential rewards, but also the risk of angry servants or guards who view your presence as a threat to their master's property. Your first stop is often the area around the church, where the concept of Christian charity creates your best opportunities for receiving alms. Medieval Christianity placed enormous emphasis on charity as a path to salvation, and many townspeople felt genuine religious obligation to help the poor. However, this charity came with conditions and judgments. You've learned to present yourself in specific ways, to recite certain prayers, to demonstrate that you're a worthy recipient of Christian mercy rather than simply a lazy vagrant. The art of begging in medieval times required sophisticated social skills that few people today would recognize. You need to read people instantly, understanding who might respond to religious appeals, who might be moved by displays of physical suffering, and who requires evidence of your desirableness. Some potential benefactors want to see that you're truly incapable of work, leading to the grim reality that visible disabilities or injuries often improved a beggar's chances of receiving help. Others respond better to demonstrations of piety and religious knowledge, requiring you to memorize prayers and biblical passages that prove your worthiness. Your voice becomes one of your most important tools. You've developed a specific tone for different situations, sometimes plaintive and weak, other times more assertive, but still respectful. Good sir, for the love of Christ and the salvation of your soul, spare a coin for one less fortunate. The words become as familiar as breathing, repeated hundreds of times each day with varying degrees of success. You learn to modulate your volume, speaking loudly enough to be heard, but not so loudly as to be considered a public nuisance that might attract the attention of town guards. The town guards represent one of your greatest constant fears. Medieval laws regarding vagrancy were harsh and inconsistently applied. In some places, begging was tolerated as long as it remained within certain boundaries. In others, it was actively criminalized, with punishments ranging from public humiliation in stocks to physical beatings or banishment from the town entirely. You've learned to recognize the guards' routines, to know which ones might be sympathetic and which ones view removing beggars as a badge of honor in maintaining public order. Competition among beggars creates another layer of complexity in your daily survival. Prime locations, the spots where foot traffic is heavy and charitable inclinations run higher, are fiercely contested. Established beggars guard their territories jealously, and newcomers must either find less favorable locations or risk confrontation. The area outside the church door, the corner near the market where people feel prosperous after successful trades, the spot where wealthy merchants pass on their way to important meetings, these become valuable real estate in the economy of desperation, where there adds another dimension to your struggles. Rain turns your already difficult existence into something nearly unbearable. Your clothes, thin and poorly made, offer little protection against water, and once wet, they remain damp for days, chilling your body and increasing your risk of illness. Medieval towns offered few places for the homeless to take shelter during storms, and those that existed, like church porches, were often already occupied by others in similar circumstances. Snow and winter cold present even greater challenges. Your body, already weakened by poor nutrition and constant exposure, struggles to maintain warmth. You've learned to stuff your clothes with whatever materials you can find, straw, rags, even leaves, to create additional insulation. Finding fuel for fires is nearly impossible, as wood and coal are valuable commodities that property owners guard carefully. When you do manage to start a small fire in some hidden corner, you must tend it carefully while remaining alert for anyone who might view it as a threat to nearby buildings. The psychological toll of constant rejection weighs heavily on your spirit. Most people you approach will ignore you completely, looking through you as if you don't exist. Others respond with active hostility, viewing your presence as an assault on their sensibilities or a threat to their property values. Children often mock you, throwing stones or refuse, while their parents either encourage the behavior or simply look away. The constant message from society is clear. You are unwanted, worthless, a problem to be solved by your own disappearance. Yet you persist because the alternative is death, and because occasional kindness reminds you that compassion still exists in the world. A merchant's wife who regularly saves bread scraps specifically for you. A priest who ensures you receive a portion when the church distributes food to the poor. A fellow beggar who shares information about which areas are currently safe and which ones to avoid. These moments of human connection become precious beyond measure, sustaining not just your body but your sense of humanity. Your relationship with food becomes fundamentally different from that of people with homes and steady income. Every scrap is precious. Every opportunity to eat must be seized, regardless of the food's condition or your personal preferences. You've learned to eat things that would disgust your former self: moldy bread, scraps of meat of questionable origin, vegetables that others have discarded as inedible. Your stomach has adapted to irregular eating patterns, sometimes going days between substantial meals, other times gorging when unexpected opportunities arise. Water, something most people take for granted, requires constant attention and planning. Public wells and fountains exist in most towns, but access depends on timing and the tolerance of other users. You've learned to approach during less busy periods, often very early in the morning or late in the evening. The water itself may not be particularly clean, but it's better than the alternatives of puddles or streams that run through town collecting waste and refuse. Personal hygiene becomes nearly impossible to maintain. Without access to private spaces, clean water, or soap, your body accumulates layers of dirt and grime that become part of your identity in the eyes of others. The smell alone marks you as different, as other, reinforcing the social barriers between yourself and the housed population. Yet you do what you can, washing hands and face when opportunities arise, trying to maintain some dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. As the day progresses, your route through town becomes a carefully orchestrated performance, repeated with endless variation. Each potential benefactor requires a slightly different approach, a different story, a different presentation of your need. You become an expert reader of human nature, understanding within seconds whether someone might be approachable or whether your presence will only invite hostility. The successful medieval beggar develops an intricate understanding of the local economy and social rhythms. Market days bring more people and potentially more opportunities, but also increased competition and greater scrutiny from authorities concerned about maintaining order. Religious festivals create occasions when charitable giving increases dramatically, but they also attract beggars from surrounding areas, diluting the available resources among more people. Your knowledge of the town becomes encyclopedic in its detail. You know which shops might have scraps of food at the end of the day, which wealthy households sometimes distribute leftover meals, which taverns allow beggars to warm themselves briefly during cold weather, and which areas are absolutely forbidden territory where your presence will be met with immediate and forceful removal. The relationships you develop with other beggars create a complex social world that exists beneath the notice of most townspeople. Within the beggar community, hierarchies and alliances form based on factors that outsiders would never recognize as significant. Those who have held the same spot for years command respect and deference from newcomers. Individuals with particular skills, perhaps the ability to read and write, or knowledge of herbal remedies, or connections to sympathetic clergy, occupy positions of relative influence within this marginalized society. Information sharing becomes crucial to survival, and you learn quickly who can be trusted and who might betray you for personal advantage. When town guards are planning a sweep to clear beggars from particular areas, word spreads through informal networks with remarkable speed. When a wealthy merchant is hosting a celebration that might result in generous distributions of leftover food, everyone who needs to know hears about it within hours. These communication systems operate invisibly to the housed population, but represent sophisticated social organization among people society dismisses as disorganized vagrants. The beggar community also develops its own moral codes and systems of mutual obligation that exist separately from the official laws and religious teachings of mainstream society. Stealing from other beggars is considered a grave offense that can result in social ostracism or even physical punishment administered by the community itself. Sharing information about dangers or opportunities is expected, and those who hoard knowledge for personal advantage find themselves excluded from the cooperative networks that make survival possible. Your understanding of human psychology becomes remarkably sophisticated through constant observation and interaction. You learn to read facial expressions and body language with precision that would impress modern psychologists. The slight tightening around someone's eyes that indicates they're annoyed by your presence. The softening of features that suggests genuine sympathy rather than performative charity. The nervous glances that reveal someone is worried about being seen, giving to beggars by their social peers. These subtle cues determine your approach and often mean the difference between receiving help and facing rejection or even violence. The concept of time takes on different meanings when you live on the streets. Without the structuring influence of regular employment or household routines, your days are organized around different rhythms. The bells that mark religious services throughout the day become important temporal markers, not for spiritual reasons, but because they signal times when charitable distributions might occur, or when certain areas become more or less safe for begging. The changing angle of sunlight tells you when merchants will be closing their shops and might have food scraps to dispose of. The gathering of workers at taverns in the evening creates both opportunities and dangers, as alcohol loosens both purse strings and violent impulses. Your relationship with the natural world becomes more intimate and immediate than that of people who live in houses. You notice changes in weather with sensitivity born of necessity, reading cloud patterns and wind shifts that warn of coming rain or cold. You know which plants growing in waste spaces around town are edible, which ones have medicinal properties, and which ones should be avoided. The phases of the moon matter because they determine how much light will be available during nighttime hours when you might need to move through the town or find your sleeping spot. Sleep itself becomes a skill that must be learned and practiced. The ability to fall asleep despite discomfort, cold, and the constant awareness of vulnerability requires mental discipline that most housed people never develop. You learn to sleep lightly, remaining alert enough to wake at the first sign of danger while still achieving enough rest to function. You discover positions that minimize pain from sleeping on hard surfaces and techniques for staying warm that make use of whatever materials are available. The psychological challenge of maintaining hope and purpose in circumstances that seem designed to crush the human spirit requires reserves of mental strength that you didn't know you possessed. Each morning requires a conscious decision to continue to face another day of rejection and hardship rather than simply giving up. The small victories, a particularly good day of begging, an unexpected kindness from a stranger, a warm place to sleep for one night, become precious memories that sustain you through darker times. Your sense of identity undergoes profound changes as you adapt to life as a beggar. The person you were before, with whatever skills, relationships, and self-image you once possessed, gradually fades as the immediate demands of survival dominate your consciousness. Yet within this transformation, you also discover aspects of yourself that you might never have known existed. Resilience you didn't know you had. Creativity in problem solving. The capacity for gratitude for things that once seemed insignificant. An understanding of human nature that comes only from observing it from society's margins. The rare moments of genuine human connection become treasured experiences that remind you of your own humanity. When someone looks you in the eye while giving you alms, acknowledging you as a fellow human being, rather than an embarrassing problem to be quickly dismissed. When another beggar shares their food with you without expectation of repayment. When a child waves at you despite their parents' disapproval. These moments of recognition pierce through the dehumanizing aspects of street life and remind you that you remain a person worthy of dignity and respect. Evening brings its own challenges and small mercies. As the town settles into night, you must find another place to sleep, another doorway or alcove that offers minimal protection from the elements. The cycle begins again with the morning light, but for now, as darkness falls around you, you pull your thin cloak tighter and prepare for another night of fitful rest on medieval stone, dreaming, perhaps, of warmth, food, and the human dignity that poverty cannot quite extinguish, no matter how hard it tries. The rise and fall of Brother Benedict, the beggar's saint. In the year 1189, in the bustling port city of Marseille, a most unusual figure emerged from the ranks of medieval Europe's forgotten poor. His name was Benedict of Marseille, though history would remember him by many other names. Brother Benedict, the beggar's saint, and to some, the heretic of the harbour. His story illuminates not just one man's extraordinary journey from destitution to influence, but the complex relationship between poverty, spirituality, and power in medieval society. Benedict's early life remains shrouded in the mystery that surrounds most people of his social class during this period. What we know comes primarily from the detailed records kept by the Church during his later trial for heresy. Documents that survive in the archives of the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de la Garde. According to these records, Benedict was born sometime around 1150 to a family of dock workers in Marseille's poorest quarter, the area known as the Pagnon, where narrow streets wound between crumbling tenements that housed the city's laborers, fishermen, and transient workers. The Mediterranean world of the late 12th century was a place of incredible opportunity and crushing poverty existing side by side. Marseille, as one of Europe's most important ports, attracted merchants from across the known world. Venetian traders brought silks and spices from the east, while Spanish vessels carried silver and leather goods. The constant flow of commerce created wealth for some, but for families like Benedict's, it meant only the back-breaking labor of loading and unloading ships for wages that barely sustained life. Benedict's father, according to church records, died in a dock accident when the boy was barely 12 years old. In medieval times, such accidents were commonplace and rarely investigated. Heavy cargo shifted unexpectedly, ropes snapped under too much weight. Workers fell into the harbor and drowned because few knew how to swim. For families living at subsistence level, the loss of the primary wage earner meant immediate catastrophe. Benedict's mother, left with 3 children and no means of support, faced the stark choices available to medieval widows: remarriage to whoever would accept a woman with children, prostitution, or begging. She chose begging, and young Benedict learnt the harsh realities of street survival at an age when most children were still protected by family structures. He discovered that a child's presence often increased the sympathy of potential benefactors, as people were more likely to give alms to a woman with obvious dependence. But he also learned that childhood offered no protection from the cruelties of medieval street life. Older beggars saw children as competition for limited resources. Town guards viewed them as future criminals to be discouraged through early harsh treatment. Even charitable church officials often distinguished between deserving and undeserving poor, and children whose parents were seen as capable of work fell into the latter category. Benedict's mother died of fever when he was 15, leaving him completely alone in a world that had little place for orphaned adolescents. The guild system that dominated medieval urban life required family connections or substantial payments for apprenticeships. The church offered some opportunities for poor boys, but required literacy and family support that Benedict lacked. Military service might have provided an option, but the Crusades were winding down, and local conflicts offered only temporary employment for foot soldiers who were considered expendable. For 3 years, Benedict survived through begging, theft, and occasional day labor when his youth and strength could earn him a few coins. The records describe him during this period as unremarkable in every way, another face in the crowd of dispossessed that filled medieval cities. He slept in doorways, competed for scraps, and developed the hard edges necessary for survival in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. The transformation that would make Benedict famous began, according to his own later testimony, with a vision that occurred during the winter of 1171, sleeping in the doorway of the church of Saint Victor. One of Marseille's oldest religious sites, Benedict claimed that Saint Martin of Tours appeared to him in a dream. Saint Martin, the patron saint of beggars and outcasts, allegedly commanded Benedict to minister to the poorest of the poor, but to do so in a way that challenged the established order of medieval society. Whether genuine religious experience or the desperate imagination of a starving young man, this vision changed everything about Benedict's approach to his circumstances. Instead of competing with other beggars for charitable scraps, he began organizing them. He established what he called the Brotherhood of the Empty Bowl, a loose confederation of Marseille's beggars that operated according to principles that were revolutionary for their time. Benedict's first innovation was the establishment of designated territories for different types of begging, rather than fighting over prime locations. Members of his brotherhood agreed to rotate positions according to a schedule that ensured everyone had access to the most profitable spots. Those who were disabled or elderly received priority for locations that required less physical mobility, while younger, stronger beggars took responsibility for areas that involved more walking or potential danger from hostile townspeople. More importantly, Benedict instituted a sharing system that ran counter to the every person for themselves mentality that typically governed street life. Members of the Brotherhood contributed a portion of their daily takings to a common fund that provided for those who were sick, injured, or simply unlucky on any given day. This created a rudimentary social safety net within a population that had been abandoned by all other social institutions. The Brotherhood also developed sophisticated intelligence networks that tracked the movements and charitable inclinations of Marseille's wealthy residents. They knew which merchants had successful trading ventures and might be feeling generous, which religious festivals created opportunities for increased giving, and which political events might affect the mood of potential benefactors. This information was shared freely among members, increasing everyone's chances of success. Benedict's organizational skills soon attracted attention beyond the beggar community. Marseille's established religious authorities initially viewed the Brotherhood with suspicion, seeing it as a potential source of unrest that might disrupt the careful social order that kept the poor marginalized but manageable. However, the Brotherhood's emphasis on religious devotion and non-violence gradually won over some clerical supporters. Benedict had taught himself to read using discarded religious texts and broken pieces of scripture that he found or that were given to him by sympathetic priests. His sermons to the Brotherhood, delivered in the pre-dawn hours before the day's begging began, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Christian theology that impressed educated observers. He preached that poverty was not a sin to be ashamed of, but a blessing that brought its sufferers closer to the suffering of Christ. This message resonated powerfully with people who had been told by society that their condition was evidence of moral failing or divine disfavor. Benedict argued instead that the poor were specially chosen by God to demonstrate Christian virtue through their patience and faith in the face of earthly suffering. He claimed that the wealthy had a much harder path to salvation because their comfort insulated them from the spiritual growth that came through hardship. The Brotherhood began attracting members from beyond the traditional beggar community. Impoverished widows, unemployed laborers, and even some members of the lower clergy joined Benedict's movement. His evening gatherings, held in abandoned buildings or secluded courtyards, featured communal meals prepared from the day's collective takings, shared prayers, and discussions of scripture that emphasized themes of social justice and divine concern for the oppressed. As the Brotherhood grew in size and influence, it also began engaging in activities that went beyond simple mutual aid. Members started advocating for better treatment of the poor by local authorities, organizing peaceful protests against particularly harsh enforcement of vagrancy laws, and even intervening to protect vulnerable individuals from abuse by more powerful members of society. Benedict's personal reputation grew along with his movement. Stories circulated about his ability to survive on impossibly little food, his inexhaustible energy despite sleeping rough, and his uncanny ability to appear wherever he was most needed to help someone in crisis. Some of these stories were certainly exaggerated in the telling, but they reflected genuine admiration for his dedication to serving others despite his own desperate circumstances. The turning point in Benedict's story came in 1176, when he began preaching publicly in Marseille's marketplaces rather than restricting his message to private gatherings of the Brotherhood. His sermons attracted large crowds, including many people who were not themselves poor but were moved by his message of Christian charity and social responsibility. Benedict called upon the wealthy to see their riches as a trust from God that should be used to alleviate suffering rather than to accumulate more comfort for themselves. Benedict's public preaching represented a significant escalation in his challenge to established authority. Standing in the bustling marketplace, surrounded by merchants hawking their wares and shoppers bargaining for goods, he presented an alternative vision of how Christian society should function. His physical appearance, still clearly that of someone who lived on the streets despite his growing influence, lent authenticity to his message in ways that well-fed clergy could never match. When he spoke of hunger, his sunken cheeks and thin frame testified to the truth of his words. When he discussed the suffering of the poor, his worn clothing and weathered skin provided visible evidence of lives lived in hardship. The content of Benedict's marketplace sermons drew heavily from Scripture, but interpreted familiar passages in ways that emphasized themes of economic justice and divine judgment. He frequently cited the Gospel of Matthew, particularly Jesus' teaching that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Benedict argued that this was not mere metaphor but literal truth, that the wealthy faced genuine spiritual peril because their comfort insulated them from the suffering that brought people closer to God's understanding. His interpretation of the parable of Lazarus and the rich man resonated powerfully with both poor and wealthy listeners, though for different reasons. Benedict described in vivid detail how the rich man had ignored the beggar at his gate, focusing not just on the obvious moral failing, but on the psychological mechanisms that allowed wealthy people to become blind to suffering that occurred literally on their doorsteps. He suggested that wealth created a kind of spiritual numbness that prevented the rich from recognizing the humanity of the poor, a critique that made many wealthy listeners profoundly uncomfortable. The crowds that gathered for Benedict's sermons grew larger with each appearance, creating both opportunities and dangers for his movement. Sympathetic listeners began making donations directly to Benedict rather than through official church channels, seeing him as a more authentic representative of Christian charity than the institutional clergy. Some wealthy merchants, moved by his message and perhaps concerned about their own spiritual fate, began providing substantial support to the Brotherhood, funding expanded charitable activities, and even offering property that could be used as gathering spaces. This growing financial support allowed the Brotherhood to expand its operations beyond simple mutual aid among beggars. They began operating what amounted to primitive social services, including a basic medical clinic where members with knowledge of herbal healing treated the sick and injured poor who had no access to official medical care. They established a system for housing particularly vulnerable individuals, especially elderly beggars and women with young children, in abandoned buildings that they repaired and maintained through collective labor. The Brotherhood also began engaging in what we might today call community organizing, helping poor people navigate bureaucratic systems and advocate for their rights before local authorities. When a widow was being evicted from her home by an unscrupulous landlord, Brotherhood members would appear at hearings to provide testimony and moral support. When workers were being cheated of fair wages, the Brotherhood would organize collective action to pressure employers into honest payment. These activities made Benedict and his followers increasingly visible to secular authorities who viewed such organizing with deep suspicion. Benedict's personal charisma played a crucial role in the Brotherhood's expansion and influence. Those who heard him speak described an intensity and conviction that seemed to transcend his humble circumstances. His voice, despite years of exposure to harsh weather and inadequate nutrition, carried clearly across crowded marketplaces. His eyes, witnesses reported, seemed to look through superficial social distinctions to see the essential humanity in everyone he encountered. Even his physical frailty became a source of moral authority, proof that his commitment to serving others took precedence over his own comfort and well-being. The Brotherhood's growth also attracted individuals whose motivations were less pure than Benedict's vision. Some joined seeking the material support and protection that membership provided rather than out of genuine commitment to the movement's ideals. Others saw opportunities to exploit the organization's growing resources for personal gain. Benedict struggled with these challenges, attempting to maintain the Brotherhood's founding principles while managing an increasingly complex organization that included hundreds of members with varying levels of commitment and understanding. The theological sophistication of Benedict's teaching continued to develop as he engaged with both supporters and critics. He began articulating a comprehensive vision of Christian society that challenged not just individual behaviors, but structural arrangements that perpetuated poverty and inequality. He argued that the accumulation of excessive wealth was itself sinful, regardless of how charitably the wealthy might distribute portions of their riches, because it represented a failure to recognize that all material goods ultimately belonged to God and should be shared equitably among all people. These increasingly radical economic teachings aligned Benedict's movement with broader currents of religious dissent that were spreading across Europe during this period. The wealth of the institutional church had become a source of scandal and criticism, with reform movements arguing that clergy should return to the apostolic poverty practiced by Jesus and his disciples. Benedict's message resonated with these critiques, though he focused more on the obligations of wealthy lay people than on clerical corruption. These public sermons inevitably brought Benedict to the attention of both secular and religious authorities who viewed his growing influence with alarm. Medieval society depended upon clear hierarchies and defined roles, and Benedict's suggestion that the poor might have spiritual insights unavailable to the wealthy threatened fundamental assumptions about social order. His claims that God particularly favored the destitute seemed to challenge the divine right of nobles and wealthy merchants to their privileged positions. The church hierarchy found Benedict's theology particularly troubling because it echoed some of the arguments being made by various heretical movements that were spreading across Europe during this period. The Cathars in southern France, the Waldensians in the Alps, and other groups were preaching that the official church had become too wealthy and corrupt to serve as a reliable guide to salvation. Benedict's emphasis on poverty as a spiritual advantage seemed to align with these dangerous ideas. In 1178, Benedict was summoned to appear before a tribunal of church officials headed by the Archbishop of Aix-en-Provence. The charges against him included preaching without proper authority, spreading doctrines that contradicted established church teaching, and creating unauthorized religious organizations that bypassed official ecclesiastical control. The trial records, preserved in remarkable detail, provide insight into both Benedict's theological sophistication and the political calculations of his judges. Benedict defended himself with arguments drawn from Scripture and the writings of the Church Fathers, demonstrating an education that impressed even his accusers. He argued that his work among the poor was a direct response to Christ's commandment to care for the least fortunate members of society. He pointed out that many officially recognized saints had begun their religious careers by ministering to outcasts and marginalized people, and that his Brotherhood's activities were entirely consistent with established Christian tradition. However, Benedict's judges were more concerned with maintaining institutional control than with theological nuance. They offered him a compromise. He could continue his charitable work if he agreed to place the Brotherhood under official church supervision and ceased his public preaching. This would have allowed him to maintain his organization while ensuring that it operated within acceptable bounds of ecclesiastical authority. Benedict's response revealed the depth of his commitment to the independence and dignity of the poor. He refused the compromise, arguing that placing the Brotherhood under church control would fundamentally change its character and effectiveness. He claimed that the poor needed advocates who understood their circumstances from personal experience, not well-meaning, but distant officials who viewed poverty as an abstract theological concept rather than a lived reality. This refusal sealed Benedict's fate. In 1179, he was formally excommunicated and banished from Marseille. The Brotherhood was declared an illegal organization, and its members were forbidden from gathering under threat of similar punishment. Benedict left the city in early spring, accompanied by a small group of his most devoted followers. and disappeared into the broader world of medieval Europe. For several years, reports of Benedict's activities surfaced from various locations across southern France and northern Spain. He apparently continued organizing communities of beggars and outcasts, always staying ahead of authorities who sought to suppress his movement. Some accounts describe miraculous healings performed by Benedict, though these stories are difficult to separate from the legends that tend to accumulate around controversial religious figures. The final chapter of Benedict's story remains shrouded in mystery. In 1185, reports reached Marseille that he had died while ministering to plague victims in a small village near Barcelona. Other accounts claim he was murdered by brigands while traveling between towns. Still others suggest that he simply vanished, choosing to disappear rather than face continued persecution. What remained after Benedict's departure was a legacy that continued to influence how medieval society thought about poverty and social responsibility. The Brotherhood of the Empty Bowl had demonstrated that even the most marginalized people could organize effectively to improve their circumstances. Benedict's theological arguments about the spiritual value of poverty continued to circulate, influencing later religious movements and social reforms. Perhaps most importantly, Benedict's story reveals the complex relationship between individual agency and social structures in medieval life. Despite being born into circumstances that seemed to offer no opportunities for advancement or influence, he managed to create a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about social order and religious authority. His life illustrates both the possibilities for resistance that existed within medieval society and the powerful forces that worked to maintain existing hierarchies. The records of Benedict's trial and the subsequent suppression of his movement provide modern historians with rare insights into the experiences and perspectives of medieval Europe's poorest residents. Through his story, we can begin to understand not just the material conditions of poverty in this period, but the intellectual and spiritual lives of people who were usually invisible to official record keepers. Benedict of Marseille remains a figure who defies easy categorization, a beggar who became a theologian, an outcast who challenged authority, a poor man who created lasting change. His story reminds us that even in societies structured to maintain inequality, individual vision and collective action could sometimes break through barriers that seemed insurmountable, creating new possibilities for human dignity and social justice. The mystery of the pilgrim tokens, archaeological secrets of medieval charity. In the autumn of 1987, construction workers renovating the basement of a medieval church in Canterbury made a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of how charity and begging operated in medieval Europe. Hidden beneath centuries of accumulated debris, they uncovered a sealed chamber containing thousands of small metal tokens, each no larger than a modern coin, bearing intricate symbols and markings that told a story archaeologists are still working to fully decode. The Canterbury Hoard, as it came to be known, represents one of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to medieval poverty and charitable practices ever made. The tokens, numbering over 3,000 individual pieces, were found carefully sorted into wooden boxes that had somehow survived the damp conditions of the underground chamber. Initial carbon dating placed their creation between 1250 and 1400, spanning nearly 150 years of medieval social history. What made this discovery so extraordinary was not just the quantity of tokens, but their obvious sophistication and the systematic way they had been preserved. These were not random artifacts that had accumulated by chance, but rather evidence of a complex, organized system that had operated for generations before being deliberately sealed away and forgotten. The chamber itself showed signs of careful construction. with stone walls that had been specifically designed to protect its contents from moisture and decay. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the lead archaeologist assigned to study the Canterbury hoard, spent the better part of a decade analyzing these mysterious objects. Her work, published in a series of groundbreaking papers in the Journal of Medieval Archaeology, revealed evidence of what she termed the hidden economy of medieval charity, a sophisticated network of institutions, individuals, and practices that operated parallel to the official systems of poor relief documented in church and government records. The tokens themselves were made from various metals, ranging from crude iron pieces to elaborately crafted silver specimens that showed remarkable artistic skill, most measured between 15 and 20 millimeters in diameter, small enough to be easily concealed in a palm or sewn into clothing. The symbols stamped or engraved on their surfaces included religious imagery such as crosses, saints' faces, and biblical scenes, but also more mysterious markings that appeared to be coded information about specific locations, time periods, or perhaps the worthiness of particular recipients. Dr. Thornfield's analysis revealed that the tokens fell into several distinct categories based on their metallurgy, craftsmanship, and symbolic content. The most common type, accounting for roughly 60% of the total, were simple iron discs bearing basic Christian symbols like crosses or fish. These appeared to be mass-produced, possibly by local blacksmiths working from standardized templates. Their crude construction suggested they were intended for everyday use rather than special occasions. A second category consisted of bronze tokens that showed more sophisticated craftsmanship and featured images of specific saints or religious scenes. These pieces often included Latin inscriptions around their edges. Phrases like Caritas, Christi, the Charity of Christ, or Paparibus, Semper, always for the poor. The bronze tokens appeared to have been produced by more skilled craftsmen, possibly working in monastic workshops where both religious knowledge and metal-working expertise were available. The most intriguing category consisted of silver tokens that demonstrated exceptional artistic quality and bore symbols that seemed to encode specific information beyond simple religious devotion. Some featured complex geometric patterns that Dr. Thornfield believed might represent maps or directions to particular locations. Others showed combinations of religious and secular imagery that suggested connections to specific guilds, noble families, or ecclesiastical institutions. Perhaps most mysteriously, a small number of tokens were made from metals that analysis showed had been imported from distant locations. Tin from Cornwall, silver from German mines, even small amounts of gold that chemical analysis suggested originated in Africa. The presence of these exotic materials implied trading networks and financial resources that seemed inconsistent with their apparent use in charitable activities involving the poorest members of society. The systematic study of these tokens required Dr. Thornfield to develop entirely new methodologies for medieval archaeological analysis. She collaborated with numismatists who specialized in medieval coinage, metallurgists who could identify the precise origins of various metal alloys, and even linguists who helped decode the Latin and vernacular inscriptions found on many pieces. The interdisciplinary nature of this research revealed connections between apparently disparate aspects of medieval life that had previously been studied in isolation. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Dr. Thornfield compared the Canterbury tokens with similar objects that had been discovered at other medieval sites across Europe but had never been properly categorized or understood. Museums in Paris, Rome, Vienna, and Barcelona all had collections of small metal tokens that had been dismissed as curiosities or misidentified as pilgrimage badges. When these objects were re-examined using the analytical framework developed for the Canterbury hoard, clear patterns emerged that suggested a continent-wide system of charitable organization. The tokens found in different locations shared certain symbolic conventions that appeared to transcend national and linguistic boundaries. A stylized hand extended in blessing appeared on tokens from England to Italy, always rendered in the same distinctive style regardless of the local artistic traditions of their place of manufacture. Similarly, certain geometric patterns, combinations of stars and circles that seemed to encode numerical information, appeared with remarkable consistency across geographical and temporal boundaries. Dr. Thornfield's research team developed a theory that these tokens represented evidence of what they termed the Great Pilgrimage Charity Network, a coordinated system that operated across medieval Europe to facilitate the movement and support of pilgrims, many of whom were essentially religious beggars traveling from shrine to shrine. The tokens, they proposed, served as a form of currency that could be exchanged for food, shelter, or other assistance at participating institutions along major pilgrimage routes. This theory gained support from the discovery of written records in various monastic archives that made oblique references to tokens of merit and signs of worthiness that pilgrims could present to receive aid. A manuscript from the Abbey of Cluny, dating to 1289, described a system whereby pilgrims who demonstrated particular piety or need could receive marks of recognition that would ensure their welcome at other religious houses along their journey. However, the Canterbury hoard contained evidence that suggested the token system extended far beyond simple pilgrimage support. Many of the tokens showed wear patterns consistent with frequent handling and exchange, implying they had been used repeatedly in local contexts rather than simply carried by traveling pilgrims. Some pieces had been deliberately modified after their initial creation, with additional symbols scratched or punched into their surfaces, suggesting ongoing use in evolving circumstances. The sealed chamber where the tokens were discovered provided additional clues about their ultimate fate. Along with the tokens themselves, archaeologists found fragments of documents written on parchment, most too deteriorated to read completely, but containing enough legible text to provide context. These documents appeared to be records of token distribution, lists of names and numbers that suggested careful accounting of who had received tokens and for what purposes. One partially readable document, painstakingly reconstructed by medieval historians, appeared to describe the systematic collection and destruction of tokens during the early 15th century. The fragmentary text mentioned false tokens and unauthorized distributions that had corrupted the system of true charity. This suggested that the token network had eventually fallen victim to fraud and abuse, leading to its deliberate suppression by religious or secular authorities. The Canterbury discovery also shed new light on the economic realities of medieval charitable activities. Chemical analysis of metal traces found in the chamber revealed that tokens had been melted down and their materials reused, probably to create new tokens or other metal objects. This recycling process implied that the token system operated with sophisticated understanding of resource management and material value, characteristics that challenged traditional assumptions about the primitive nature of medieval charitable organizations. Further investigation revealed that the Canterbury Church itself had been built on the site of an earlier religious foundation that had been destroyed during the Black Death pandemic of the 14th century. The sealed chamber appeared to have been created during the reconstruction process, suggesting that the token hoard represented the archives of the previous institution, deliberately preserved during a period of social upheaval and institutional collapse. Dr. Thornfield's team used ground-penetrating radar to search for additional hidden chambers beneath other medieval churches in Canterbury and the surrounding region. Their surveys identified several locations where similar sealed spaces might exist, though permission for excavation has been limited by the continuing religious use of these buildings. However, one small dig at the ruins of a medieval hospital outside Canterbury did uncover a smaller cache of tokens that confirmed many of the patterns identified in the main hoard. The Canterbury tokens also provided evidence for the existence of counterfeit charitable currencies in medieval times. Several pieces in the collection showed clear signs of having been crude copies of more sophisticated originals, with symbols that had been imperfectly reproduced and metal composition that differed from authentic examples. This suggested that the token system had become valuable enough to attract criminal exploitation, a development that may have contributed to its eventual abandonment. Modern scientific analysis techniques have revealed details about the Canterbury tokens that would have been impossible to discover using traditional archaeological methods. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy identified trace elements in the metals that pinpointed their geographical origins with remarkable precision. Scanning electron microscopy revealed microscopic details of manufacturing techniques that showed how different tokens had been produced using various methods, from simple stamping to complex multi-stage processes involving multiple craftsmen. Perhaps most intriguingly, some tokens showed evidence of having been deliberately altered or encoded with additional information after their initial creation. Microscopic scratches and marks that were invisible to the naked eye appeared to form patterns that might represent a form of medieval cryptography. Dr. Thornfield collaborated with experts in historical codes and ciphers to attempt decryption of these markings, though their meaning remains largely mysterious. The challenge of decoding these cryptographic elements has attracted scholars from multiple disciplines, including mathematicians, linguists, and computer scientists who have applied modern analytical techniques to medieval puzzles. Some researchers have suggested that the patterns might represent numerical codes that indicated specific amounts of aid to be provided, while others propose that they functioned as authentication marks that helped distinguish genuine tokens from counterfeits. The variety of marking styles suggests that multiple encoding systems may have been used simultaneously, perhaps by different organizations or during different time periods. One particularly intriguing discovery involved tokens that appeared to have been deliberately damaged or modified in specific ways that seemed to convey information. Small notches cut into edges at precise locations, patterns of scratches that followed geometric principles, and areas where metal had been carefully filed away, all suggested systematic methods of encoding additional data onto already produced tokens. This practice of modifying tokens might have allowed the system to adapt to changing circumstances without requiring the production of entirely new pieces. The study of token distribution patterns has revealed unexpected insights into medieval travel and communication networks. By mapping the locations where similar tokens have been found, researchers have identified what appear to be major routes connecting religious sites, trading centers, and urban areas across medieval Europe. These routes often deviated from the major roads and pilgrimage paths documented in historical records, suggesting the existence of alternative networks used primarily by marginalized populations who had reasons to avoid official authority. Dr. Thornfield's team also investigated the social contexts in which tokens were likely used. Consulting historical records of medieval charitable institutions, hospitals, monasteries, and almshouses, they discovered numerous references to marks or signs that recipients of charity were required to present, though the documents rarely provided detailed descriptions of these objects. By correlating the archaeological evidence with these textual references, researchers were able to construct hypothetical models of how the token system might have operated in practice. The tokens appear to have served multiple functions beyond simple identification or authorization for receiving aid. Some may have operated as a form of credit system, allowing recipients to accumulate tokens that could later be exchanged for goods or services at participating institutions. Others might have functioned as loyalty markers, rewarding individuals who demonstrated particular piety or service to charitable organizations. Still others could have been protective amulets that combined practical and spiritual functions, offering both material assistance and psychological comfort to people living in desperate circumstances. The manufacturing techniques revealed by microscopic analysis demonstrate remarkable sophistication that challenges assumptions about medieval metalworking capabilities. Some tokens show evidence of having been produced using lost wax casting methods that allowed for extremely fine detail and consistency across multiple pieces. Others display characteristics of die-striking techniques that required specialized tools and considerable skill to execute properly. The variety of manufacturing methods suggests a distributed production system involving craftsmen with different specializations working in coordination to supply the token network. Chemical analysis of patina and corrosion products on token surfaces has provided information about the environments in which they were stored and used. Tokens that spent significant time in maritime environments showed different corrosion patterns from those kept primarily in urban or rural settings. Some pieces display traces of organic materials, including textiles, leather, and wood, suggesting they were commonly stored in pouches or containers made from these materials. Others show evidence of having been buried deliberately, perhaps as offerings or for safekeeping during times of danger. The Canterbury Chamber itself has become the subject of intensive archaeological investigation beyond the tokens it contained. The construction techniques used to create this sealed space demonstrate sophisticated understanding of preservation principles. The walls were lined with materials designed to absorb moisture and protect contents from decay. The layout of the chamber suggests careful organization, with different types of tokens stored in specific locations according to principles that researchers are still working to understand fully. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive archaeological techniques have been used to search for similar chambers at other medieval sites across England and continental Europe. These surveys have identified numerous promising locations where sealed spaces might exist beneath medieval religious buildings, though excavation has been limited by the continued use of many sites for worship and the understandable reluctance of religious authorities to allow potentially disruptive archaeological work. The few additional excavations that have been permitted have yielded fascinating results that both confirm and complicate the patterns identified in the Canterbury hoard. A smaller cache discovered beneath a medieval hospital in York contained tokens that showed clear, stylistic similarities to Canterbury examples, but also included unique local variations that suggest regional adaptation of the broader system. Another find at a former monastery in Normandy revealed tokens made from materials not present in English collections, indicating that the network extended across the channel and adapted to local resource availability. The study of the Canterbury tokens has also shed light on the economic value and symbolic significance that medieval people attached to small metal objects. In a period when most transactions involved physical goods rather than abstract currency, these tokens represented a sophisticated form of symbolic exchange that bridged material and spiritual economies. They embodied concepts of worthiness, obligation, reciprocity, and divine favor in tangible forms that could be held, exchanged, and treasured by people who possessed few other material goods. Dr. Thornfield's ongoing research has expanded to include experimental archaeology, working with modern craftsmen to recreate token manufacturing techniques using medieval tools and methods. These experiments have revealed the considerable skill and time required to produce tokens of the quality found in the Canterbury hoard, suggesting that their creation represented significant economic investment by charitable organizations or wealthy patrons. The experimental work has also demonstrated how difficult it would have been to produce convincing counterfeits without access to specialized tools and expertise, though the presence of crude copies in the archaeological record shows that some forgers succeeded despite these challenges. The Canterbury hoard continues to yield new insights as analytical techniques become more sophisticated. Recent research using isotopic analysis has traced the origins of metals used in token production to specific mines and regions, revealing trading relationships and resource flows that connect the charitable token system to broader patterns of medieval economic activity. DNA analysis of organic residues found on some tokens has even provided information about the foods and medicines that were distributed using this system. One of the most fascinating aspects of ongoing research involves the seasonal patterns evident in token production and distribution. Analysis of the metal composition and wear patterns suggests that certain types of tokens were produced and distributed during specific times of year, possibly coordinated with harvest cycles, religious festivals, or seasonal migration patterns of beggars and pilgrims. This seasonality implies a level of planning and coordination that speaks to remarkable organizational sophistication among medieval charitable networks. Dr. Thornfield's team also discovered evidence of what they termed token families, groups of tokens that were clearly produced by the same craftsman or workshop, but distributed across vast geographical distances. These token families provide concrete evidence of the extensive reach of medieval charitable networks, with identical pieces found in locations separated by hundreds of miles. The distribution patterns suggest organized systems for transporting and allocating charitable resources that operated with efficiency that would be impressive even by modern standards. The study of wear patterns on individual tokens has revealed details about how they were actually used in daily transactions. Many pieces show specific types of damage consistent with being sewn into clothing or leather pouches, suggesting they were carried for extended periods by their users. Others display wear patterns indicating they were frequently handled and exchanged, supporting theories about their use as a form of charitable currency that circulated within communities of poor and displaced people. Advanced spectroscopic analysis has also revealed that some tokens contained trace amounts of substances that appear to be deliberately added during their manufacture. Microscopic quantities of herbs and spices, some imported from distant regions, were found embedded in the metal matrix of certain pieces. These additions may have served practical purposes, such as providing antibacterial properties, or symbolic functions related to specific religious or magical beliefs about protection and healing. The Canterbury excavation site itself continues to provide additional context for understanding the token system. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified what appear to be other sealed chambers beneath the church complex. Though ecclesiastical authorities have been reluctant to permit further excavation, however, limited drilling operations have recovered additional metal fragments and organic materials that confirm the existence of other token caches that may have been sealed during different historical periods. Recent collaboration with scholars studying similar archaeological discoveries across Europe has revealed that the Canterbury hoard was likely part of a much larger phenomenon that affected virtually every region of medieval Christendom. Token caches have now been identified at medieval sites from Ireland to Hungary, suggesting that the charitable token system operated on a scale that approached the comprehensive coverage of modern social welfare networks. This discovery has fundamentally altered scholarly understanding of how medieval society addressed poverty and social displacement. The technological sophistication revealed by detailed analysis of the Canterbury tokens challenges many assumptions about medieval manufacturing capabilities. Some pieces display evidence of advanced metallurgical techniques, including controlled atmosphere smelting and precise alloy compositions that were previously thought to be beyond medieval technical knowledge. These discoveries suggest that the craftsmen involved in token production possessed skills that placed them among the most sophisticated metalworkers of their era. Perhaps most intriguingly, recent research has identified what appear to be mathematical relationships encoded in the designs and proportions of various token types. Certain geometric patterns repeat across different categories of tokens, in ways that suggest underlying mathematical principles governing their production. These patterns may have served as quality control measures, authentication systems, or even methods for encoding information about the specific charitable purposes for which individual tokens were intended. The mystery of the Canterbury tokens represents more than just an archaeological puzzle. It illuminates the complex social networks that operated beneath the surface of documented medieval history. These small metal objects provide tangible evidence of the ingenuity and organization that characterized medieval charitable activities, revealing a world far more sophisticated and interconnected than traditional historical narratives might suggest. As research continues, the Canterbury hoard serves as a reminder that the medieval world contained layers of complexity and innovation that we are still working to understand. Each token represents not just a piece of metal, but a connection between individuals separated by geography, social class, and historical circumstance, bound together by shared commitments to charity, survival, and human dignity that transcended the formal boundaries of medieval society. Life in the court of Burgundy, when charity became performance, while the poor huddled in doorways and struggled for daily survival. The magnificent court of Burgundy in the 15th century created an entirely different relationship with poverty and charity, one that transformed human suffering into elaborate theatrical performance designed to demonstrate the moral superiority and divine favor of the wealthy. The contrast between the harsh realities we've explored and the ornate charity rituals of medieval nobility reveals the complex ways that medieval society both acknowledged and exploited the existence of widespread destitution. The Duchy of Burgundy, at its height under Philip the Good, who ruled from 1419 to 1467, represented one of the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated courts in medieval Europe. Stretching from the Low Countries through eastern France, the Burgundian territories included some of the most prosperous trading cities of the late medieval period. Bruges, Ghent, and Brussels generated enormous wealth through textile production and international commerce, while the wines of Burgundy proper commanded premium prices across the continent. This wealth created opportunities for displays of magnificence that surpassed even the courts of kings. The Burgundian court became famous throughout Europe for its elaborate ceremonies, its patronage of artists and musicians, and its cultivation of chivalric ideals that emphasized both martial prowess and Christian virtue. However, one of the most distinctive aspects of Burgundian court culture was its systematic incorporation of charitable activities into the regular cycle of courtly entertainment and political display. The daily routine of the Burgundian court began before dawn with private prayers in richly appointed chapels where walls, lined with precious tapestries, depicted scenes of saints ministering to the poor. These morning devotions were followed by elaborate breakfast ceremonies, where the Duke and his courtiers dined on delicacies prepared by skilled chefs, who had been recruited from across Europe. Fresh fish transported in specially designed tanks from the North Sea, exotic spices brought by Venetian merchants from the Orient, wines selected from the finest vineyards of the ducal domains. These meals represented consumption on a scale that would have fed dozens of poor families for weeks. Yet the same halls that witnessed such extravagant consumption also hosted regular charitable distributions that were carefully choreographed to demonstrate the Duke's Christian virtue and paternal concern for his subjects. These events, known as distributions of grace, were scheduled to coincide with major religious festivals and important political occasions, creating public spectacles that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The most elaborate of these charitable ceremonies occurred during the Easter season, when the court traditionally distributed food, clothing, and small amounts of money to carefully selected representatives of the deserving poor. The preparations for these events began weeks in advance, with court officials traveling throughout the ducal territories to identify suitable recipients who would make appropriate impressions during the public ceremonies. The criteria for selection revealed much about how the nobility viewed poverty and worthiness. Preference was given to individuals whose circumstances clearly resulted from misfortune rather than moral failing, particularly widows with young children, elderly craftsmen who had become unable to work, and veterans who had been injured in the Duke's military service. Physical appearance also mattered enormously. Recipients needed to look appropriately grateful and humble, but not so destitute as to be offensive to courtly sensibilities. Once selected, these representatives of the poor were brought to the ducal palace several days before the ceremony for what court records, euphemistically, described as preparation for grace. This process involved bathing and grooming that transformed street beggars into presentable figures who could participate in courtly rituals without disturbing the aesthetic sensibilities of noble observers. Clean clothing was provided, though it was deliberately simple and rough, to maintain the visual contrast between wealth and poverty that gave these ceremonies their dramatic impact. The charitable distributions themselves were elaborate theatrical productions that combined religious ceremony with political propaganda. The great hall of the palace was decorated with tapestries depicting biblical scenes of charity and divine judgment, while musicians provided accompaniment that emphasized themes of mercy and divine grace. The Duke, dressed in robes that incorporated religious symbolism with displays of worldly magnificence, personally handed gifts to each recipient, while courtiers and visiting dignitaries observed and commented on his generosity and piety. These ceremonies served multiple political functions beyond simple charitable relief. They demonstrated the Duke's wealth and power to visiting ambassadors and potential allies, while simultaneously showing his subjects that their ruler possessed the Christian virtues necessary for legitimate authority. The careful choreography ensured that recipients appeared genuinely grateful for ducal generosity, creating public validation of the social hierarchy that placed nobles in positions of benevolent authority over their inferiors. The economic realities underlying these charitable performances were complex and revealing. The total value of goods distributed during even the most elaborate ceremonies represented a tiny fraction of the court's regular expenditures on entertainment, clothing, and luxury goods. A single tapestry commissioned for the Duke's private chambers might cost more than the combined value of charity, distributed to hundreds of poor families over an entire year. Court records preserved in the Burgundian archives provide detailed information about the costs and logistics of these charitable activities. The preparations for a major distribution required the services of numerous court officials, from the chamberlains who organized the ceremonies to the guards who maintained order during public events. The total administrative costs often exceeded the value of the actual charitable gifts, suggesting that these activities were primarily valued for their symbolic and political benefits rather than their practical impact on poverty. The daily life of courtiers in this environment created a peculiar relationship with the realities of destitution that surrounded their world of luxury. Many nobles genuinely believed that their charitable activities demonstrated Christian virtue and fulfilled their moral obligations to the less fortunate. However, their actual knowledge of poverty was filtered through the carefully managed interactions of ceremonial distributions, which presented sanitized versions of destitution that confirmed rather than challenged their assumptions about social hierarchy and moral worthiness. The contrast between courtly charity and the lived experiences of actual beggars was stark and telling. While the duke's selected poor received their ceremonial gifts and returned to lives of continued hardship, the court moved on to elaborate entertainments that might include feasts lasting hours, musical performances by renowned artists, and dramatic presentations that cost more to produce than entire charitable budgets. The hunting expeditions that were central to courtly life provided another lens through which to view these contradictions. The duke and his nobles pursued deer, boar, and other game across vast private reserves that were strictly protected from poaching by harsh laws that could result in death. Sentences for hungry peasants who killed animals to feed their families. The irony that starving people might be executed for taking. Food that nobles killed for sport was apparently lost on courtiers who viewed themselves as models of Christian charity. The Burgundian court also maintained what were essentially human collections of individuals with disabilities or unusual physical characteristics, who were kept as entertainments and objects of curiosity. Dwarfs, individuals with various deformities, and people from distant lands were housed, fed, and clothed by the court. But their primary function was to amuse nobles and provide conversation topics during social gatherings. This treatment of human beings as curiosities coexisted with the court's elaborate charitable ceremonies without apparent contradiction in the minds of most participants. The religious life of the court provided additional opportunities for displays of piety that served social and political functions. The duke maintained multiple chaplains and supported religious foundations that provided some genuine charitable services. But these activities were carefully publicized and incorporated into the broader program of demonstrating ducal virtue. Private, charitable giving, which might have provided more practical help while attracting less attention, was far less common than public distributions that enhanced the duke's reputation. The seasonal rhythm of court life created regular cycles of charitable activity that corresponded more closely to the ceremonial calendar than to the actual patterns of need among the poor. Major distributions coincided with Easter, Christmas, and other religious festivals when charitable giving was expected. But little provision was made for the continuous needs of destitute populations or for emergency assistance during crises such as harsh winters or food shortages. The clothing worn by courtiers for charitable ceremonies was itself a form of communication that reinforced social hierarchies while ostensibly celebrating Christian virtue. Nobles dressed in rich fabrics and elaborate styles that emphasized their wealth and status, but incorporated religious symbols and modest colors that suggested piety and appropriate concern for spiritual rather than worldly values. The contrast with the deliberately simple clothing of charity recipients created visual messages about divine favor, social order, and the proper relationships between different classes of society. The entertainment that followed charitable distributions often included dramatic presentations or musical performances that celebrated themes of mercy, divine justice, and the rewards that awaited both generous nobles and grateful poor in the afterlife. These cultural productions reinforced the ideological framework that justified, existing social arrangements while providing courtiers with emotionally satisfying experiences of their own virtue and benevolence. The Burgundian court's approach to charity also extended to its international diplomatic activities, where charitable giving became a tool of statecraft and alliance building. When receiving foreign ambassadors, Duke Philip would often stage elaborate charitable distributions specifically designed to impress visiting dignitaries with both his wealth and his Christian virtue. These diplomatic charity performances served multiple purposes, demonstrating the Duke's resources while positioning Burgundy as a morally superior ally worthy of political and military support. The court's charitable activities also reflected broader European trends in late medieval piety that emphasized visible demonstrations of religious devotion. The growing influence of new religious movements, particularly the Devotio Moderna with its emphasis on practical Christian living, created pressure on wealthy nobles to demonstrate their spiritual commitment through charitable works. However, the Burgundian interpretation of these religious ideals consistently prioritized spectacular public displays over quieter but potentially more effective forms of assistance. The seasonal patterns of courtly charity revealed the disconnect between noble sensibilities and the actual rhythms of poverty and need. While the poor faced their greatest hardships during winter months when work was scarce and heating costs were highest, the court's major charitable distributions were timed to coincide with spring and summer religious festivals, when weather was pleasant and outdoor ceremonies could be conducted comfortably. This scheduling prioritized the comfort and convenience of noble participants over the practical needs of recipients. The court's relationship with religious institutions provided another avenue for charitable display that served political as well as spiritual purposes. The Duke patronized numerous monasteries, hospitals, and religious foundations throughout his territories, but his support was carefully publicized and often came with conditions that enhanced ducal prestige. Charitable institutions were expected to pray publicly for their patrons' welfare and to display heraldic symbols that reminded observers of ducal generosity. The elaborate record-keeping that characterized Burgundian court administration extended to charitable activities, creating detailed documentation of gifts given, recipients served, and ceremonies conducted. These records, preserved in archives across modern France and Belgium, revealed the bureaucratic complexity that surrounded even simple acts of charity. Multiple officials were responsible for different aspects of charitable distributions, from identifying worthy recipients to managing the logistics of public ceremonies, creating administrative costs that often exceeded the value of actual charitable gifts. The physical spaces of the ducal palace were designed to accommodate and enhance charitable performances. Specific rooms and courtyards were designated for different types of charitable activities, with architectural features that created appropriate settings for demonstrations of noble virtue. Grand staircases allowed the Duke to make dramatic entrances during distribution ceremonies, while elevated platforms ensured that noble participants remained literally above the recipients of their charity. The court's cultural productions, including commissioned artwork, musical compositions, and literary works, consistently reinforced themes that justified the existing social order while celebrating noble charity. Tapestries depicted biblical scenes of the wealthy sharing with the poor, but always in ways that emphasized the natural hierarchy between giver and receiver. Musical compositions for charitable ceremonies incorporated religious themes with melodies designed to evoke appropriate emotions of gratitude and reverence among recipients and observers alike. The education and training of young nobles of the Burgundian court included instruction in the proper performance of charitable activities. As part of their preparation for leadership roles, tutors taught aristocratic children not just how to give to the poor, but how to do so in ways that enhanced their own dignity and reinforced social hierarchies. Young nobles learned the appropriate facial expressions to adopt during charitable distributions, the tone of voice to use when addressing recipients, and the gestures that conveyed benevolent authority rather than mere condescension. These lessons in performative charity extended to the careful management of emotions during encounters with poverty and suffering. Noble children were taught to display appropriate sympathy without allowing themselves to be genuinely moved by the harsh realities they witnessed. The goal was to cultivate a kind of controlled compassion that allowed them to participate in charitable activities without questioning the social structures that made such charity necessary in the first place. This emotional management was considered essential for maintaining the psychological distance necessary for effective rule over populations that included large numbers of desperately poor people. The Burgundian courts also maintained detailed protocols governing which types of poor people were appropriate recipients of ducal charity and which were to be excluded. The elderly and disabled received preference over able-bodied beggars, who were often suspected of laziness or moral failing. Women, especially widows with children, were generally considered more deserving than single men, who might be seen as potential troublemakers. Veterans of military service to the Duke received special consideration, as their poverty could be attributed to honorable sacrifice rather than personal failing. These distinctions reflected broader medieval attitudes about the causes of poverty and the moral worthiness of different categories of poor people. The concept of the deserving poor, those whose circumstances resulted from misfortune rather than vice, dominated charitable thinking and created elaborate systems for evaluating and categorizing people in need. Court officials responsible for selecting recipients for charitable distributions spent considerable time investigating the backgrounds and circumstances of potential beneficiaries, creating what amounted to medieval social service bureaucracies. The physical spaces where charitable distributions occurred were carefully designed to create appropriate atmospheres for these performances of noble virtue. The great halls used for major ceremonies featured elevated platforms that literally placed noble givers above poor recipients, reinforcing social hierarchies through architectural means. Seating arrangements ensured that the most important observers, visiting dignitaries and high-ranking nobles, had optimal views of the Duke's generous gestures. Lighting was arranged to highlight the Duke and other noble participants while leaving recipients in relative shadow, directing attention to the givers rather than the receivers of charity. The timing of charitable distributions also reflected careful political calculation. Major ceremonies were scheduled to coincide with important diplomatic visits, ensuring that foreign representatives witnessed Burgundian generosity and piety. Distributions also occurred before military campaigns, creating public displays of ducal concern for subjects who would be asked to provide military service or financial support for warfare. The charitable calendar thus served strategic purposes beyond simple religious observance or humanitarian concern. The relationship between courtly charity and the broader economic systems that generated both wealth and poverty revealed fundamental contradictions that went largely unexamined by participants. The same trade networks that enriched Burgundian merchants and filled ducal coffers also created economic disruptions that pushed vulnerable populations into poverty. The guild systems that protected skilled craftsmen's prosperity also excluded many workers from stable employment. The agricultural policies that maximized noble revenues often left peasant farmers with barely enough to survive. Yet these structural causes of poverty remained largely invisible within the ideological framework that governed courtly thinking about charity. Nobles understood poverty as either divine providence, testing the faith of sufferers and providing opportunities for wealthy Christians to demonstrate virtue, or as the result of individual moral failings that separated deserving from undeserving poor. The possibility that economic and political systems themselves might generate poverty was rarely considered, as it would have undermined the entire justification for noble privilege and authority. The religious institutions supported by the Burgundian court reflected similar contradictions between charitable rhetoric and actual practice. Monasteries and convents received generous endowments that allowed them to maintain elaborate buildings, beautiful liturgical objects, and comfortable lives for their inhabitants, while providing relatively modest charitable services to surrounding poor populations. The contrast between monastic wealth and the poverty of those the monasteries ostensibly served became increasingly apparent during the late medieval period, contributing to growing criticism of religious institutions. The court's approach to managing its own servants and workers revealed additional dimensions of the complex relationship between wealth and poverty in medieval society. Lower-ranking court employees, the kitchen workers, stable hands, and cleaning staff who made noble life possible often lived in conditions only marginally better than those of street beggars. They worked long hours for minimal compensation, slept in cramped quarters, and had little job security or protection from arbitrary dismissal. Yet they were expected to participate in the theatrical productions of courtly charity, sometimes serving as stage management for distributions to the real poor who existed outside the palace walls. The seasonal rhythms of courtly life created patterns of employment and unemployment that contributed to poverty among urban populations. When the court resided in a particular city, it generated demand for goods and services that provided income for numerous workers and merchants. However, when the court moved to other locations, as it frequently did throughout the Burgundian territories, local economies contracted rapidly, leaving many people without income until the court's return. This mobility of wealth and power created unstable economic conditions that made poverty an ever-present threat for workers who depended on courtly consumption. The elaborate feasts that were central to courtly culture provided another lens through which to examine the relationship between aristocratic excess and charitable performance. A single banquet might feature dozens of elaborate dishes, many of which were barely touched by diners more interested in the visual and social spectacle than in actual eating. The leftover food from these feasts was sometimes distributed to poor people waiting outside the palace, creating moments when genuine need intersected with aristocratic waste in ways that highlighted the inequalities of medieval society. However, even these distributions of leftovers were carefully managed to serve the interests of courtly prestige. Food was not simply given away but distributed according to protocols that reinforced social hierarchies and demonstrated ducal control over resources. Recipients were expected to express appropriate gratitude and deference, performing their role in the charitable theatre that transformed aristocratic excess into demonstrations of virtue. The system created dependencies that bound poor people to wealthy patrons, while obscuring the ways that aristocratic consumption contributed to the economic conditions that made charity necessary. As our journey through the medieval world of begging comes to a close, we've travelled from the cold stone steps where destitute individuals struggled for daily survival, through the inspiring story of Brother Benedict and his revolutionary Brotherhood, into the mysterious archaeological evidence of sophisticated charitable networks, and finally to the gilded halls where nobility transformed human suffering into elaborate performance art. These four perspectives on medieval poverty reveal a world of remarkable complexity, where genuine compassion coexisted with systemic exploitation, where the poorest members of society developed ingenious survival strategies and mutual aid networks, and where the wealthy created elaborate justifications for inequality while occasionally providing real, if limited, assistance to those in need. The life of a medieval beggar encompassed far more than simple destitution. It required navigating complex social relationships, understanding economic patterns, developing survival skills that would challenge modern people, and maintaining human dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The beggars we've encountered were not passive victims, but active agents who created communities, challenged authority, and found ways to assert their humanity despite society's efforts to render them invisible. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of forgotten lives and hidden histories. Your presence here, listening to these quiet tales from the past, helps ensure that the experiences of medieval society's most vulnerable members are not entirely lost to time. If you've found comfort in these stories, if they've helped you settle into peaceful rest, remember that history is full of countless other voices waiting to be heard. I'm genuinely curious about where your interests might lead us next. What corner of the past would you like to explore together? What forgotten people or mysterious circumstances intrigue you? Your suggestions and your engagement make this journey through history a shared adventure rather than a solitary expedition. Sweet dreams, and thank you for allowing me to share these moments of historical discovery with you. Until next time, may your rest be peaceful and your curiosity about the past continue to grow. Good night.